Hello, I'm David Whitney, a member of Huddersfield Art Society, and I'm going to prepare a short presentation on pastel painting as part of the online autumn programme of the Society. And I think a useful way of breaking down this short piece of presentation to you is in 5 pieces. First of all, a word about who I am, because I'm a relatively new member of the Society and most people won't know me. Secondly, a word about the materials themselves. We should just consider what are pastels and what they can do and what the sort of support material we might have. And thirdly, some examples of my own work which I've collected together here, which roughly is over a 10-year period, composed essentially of portraits and landscapes. And fourthly, a short demonstration of me engaged in pastel work, using a shaving mirror to do a self-portrait of myself, so I can just talk through some of the key parts of preparing a portrait. To start off, a few words about myself. I've been painting for, I suppose, about 10 years, having retired from a teaching post in Leeds. I've been painting in acrylic and pastel and watercolour, but I've gained a particular interest in pastel work, so it's highly appropriate that I focus upon this. And I'm not a trained artist. I did Art A level at school, but that was a long time ago, I'm afraid. But I've picked up whatever I do know about art over the years from a whole range of historical and very fine contemporary painters. So basically it's acquired knowledge, it's not trained knowledge. Pastels, I think, are fascinating in one sense because they're pure pigment in different kinds of base. They can be very hard, they can be very soft indeed, they can be intermediate, and there's something like about 1,000 shades. So you have an enormous range of pastels to go at. And you can see here something of the kind of range which I personally have dabbled with over the years. There's Schminke pastel, which is really quite expensive, but for my use over the years, it's a little bit too soft. But very fine pastel, lovely colours, lovely tones, but for me a little bit too soft. Or I started about 10 years ago with this kind of pastel here, which in fact is really very cheap, Inscribe I think it's called, which I find too hard and without the subtlety of the colours to use. So I personally don't like the very hard Inscribe, I personally don't like the very soft Schminkel, and I go for the intermediate personally. I spend nearly all my time now, in fact all my time now, on the intermediate De La Rowney. It says art is soft pastel, but it's really relatively hard. It's an intermediate hardness. And so, over the years, I've spent, as you say, a fair amount of money collating together an enormous number of colours, which have been very valuable. And I say, in addition to the stick pastels, if we call these the stick pastels, there's the pencil pastel, which in fact I've used particularly with the Society on the pastel group, on the portrait group on the Monday evening. Now I think there can be a problem with these personally, because I think in fact they're so fine and so precise that they can lend themselves to you being really just a little bit fussy with your drawing and your painting. So I wouldn't beware, I wouldn't not use them, but I'd be careful with being over fussed with the pastel pencil. And again, there's a good range of colours. I personally would suggest, and I'm not a very good exemplar of this, that you should, where you can, you should try and use the stick pastel and the other kind of pastel together. For the preparatory work, which we'll come on to later on, I tend to use both stick pastels or other kind of pastels and a graphite stick. So I tend to use these in my pocket, out into the countryside, and that provides a quite a useful sketching base, I think, which is very valuable, and it doesn't rub very much at all. The base, or the surface you might use for pasteling can be paper based. It needs a certain amount of tooth. It needs a certain amount of reception for the pigment. So I would use a base which has a certain amount of tooth. Sometimes the base can be really quite rough, with a kind of a gritty sandpaper feel. Some of it can be quite soft, and it's possible to use board, which can be watercoloured over to give you a coloured base. Personally, I've over the years I've tried various kinds, and I've ended up using a lot of Canson paper, which is this paper, which I buy in packs of 25. Canson mid taint, as you can see, and it's got again two surfaces, which again you'll see the surfaces when I move around. One surface is relatively hard, relatively rough, I should say, and one surface is really quite soft. I tend to use the soft one rather more than the hard. The Canson paper is a good base, I would suggest, for you to use. I buy most of my materials online from, say, Jackson's, which is a good supplier. Huge number of colours and tones. And Colder Graphics, very good for pastel base, pastel blocks. The very large sheets of pastel paper I tend to get online again from Corneliusson, and that's very valuable. So most of the pastel sticks I've referred to, in fact all the pastel sticks from Colder Graphics again. I'm sure that's possible to get it online, but Colder Graphics, a very good supplier. Pasteling is a very interesting bridge, I think, between painting and drawing, and these 4 books I've brought along here might be very valuable for you to dip into to see this kind of interesting bridge. Moore Huntley, very valuable indeed to investigate pastel work with almost every other media you can think of. John Blockley, very imaginative and very expressive in how to paint with pastels, both portraits and landscapes and seascapes and whatever. Really a very good book, I think. And a very old book, but with some very, very good demonstrations in it, is Joe Singer's book on how to paint portraits in pastels. Portrait work again, specifically portraits, but a very, very interesting way of handling pastels for portrait work. The drawing the head is very valuable because obviously pasteling work is partly drawing and partly painting. And that really gives a very, very good insight into handling the head as a drawn task before one thinks necessarily about different colours. So I would suggest those 4 are a very good start, which you might want to dip into. An interesting and rather amusing reminder for me about my decade or so in pasteling was to find that in my work at home, one of the first things I ever did to pick up some pastels and to have a go with a surface, which they actually dated, as you can see here on the sheet, of April '08, which is only 12 years ago. So 12 years ago I started the process of picking up a pastel and seeing what one could do, and doing it by means of copying the master. So this is copying Degas. It's a Degas picture of me having a go, seeing what you could do with a pastel 12 years ago. And then it occurred to me to play with the old faces of the family, my very old grandfathers. I had all kinds of little tiny photographs of grandfathers. My auntie who reached 100. And I began to play with different styles and different ways of working with the pastels, quite expressively, to see just what one could do with pastels. I went to a life class, and it's interesting to see what one could do with colour and without colour, with graphite or with colour, with a very old face, pressing the colours quite hard into the surface, or again. doing the same sort of thing. Before I moved on, later on, in the society, in the portrait group, using pastel pencils. So my first outset with the society with pasteling was heavy. Was heavier work, more expressive work with pastel sticks and not pastel pencils. As we move along here, you can see the effect of trying to see how pastel pencils could be worked. I think pastel pencils are very valuable. They give a great deal of precision, as you can see, but they can in fact make, I think they can make for a degree of fuss in the picture, and it loses a certain amount of bounce, a certain amount of expressiveness. But nevertheless, I wouldn't underplay the value of a pastel pencil. Maybe mixed with the other type of pastel work. So some of these pictures on the wall here are work which I've done on a Monday night in the society. Some of which I've done at home, just for the fun of it. Okay, what I would suggest in some portrait work is to indicate to you that it is actually fun sometimes to strike a likeness, to try and deliberately strike a likeness, which was I suppose my prime intent with my two granddaughters on the wall here, and to retain a likeness. I think a likeness which I got with John here when he once dressed up as the butcher in the portrait group on a Monday evening in Huddersfield. So sometimes it's quite useful to kind of use precision and maybe not too much expressiveness to retain a likeness. But on the other hand, of course, the real skill is to be expressive and to be loose at the same time as to retain this degree of likeness. Here's another little example, which is not necessarily terribly wonderful, I don't think, but it was me trying to show what I felt about this particular valley of the Wharfe, and a skein of snow was coming down into the landscape. So it's a kind of an interesting sort of image of violets and so on down the valley of the Wharfe. So a puddle, a shower of snow, an incipient storm. I do think actually it is important in almost any picture you do is to think quite hard about what you're trying to say. What is your memory? What actually took you to the picture in the first instance? And to keep that in your mind as you work on the picture. Is it colour? Is it silhouette? Is it noise? Because here one thing was my one of my main concerns nearly all the time was the roar of the tide. The roar and the smell of the tide, almost the fear of the boiling water. So all the time in almost every picture here that I've probably ever done was to try and think about what moved you about the image or about the landscape or about even the portrait, and retain that in your mind all the time as you as you pick the pastel up and you apply colour or whatever. So hold on to the memory of what drew you to the picture in the first instance. In this part of the video, I'm going to do some work on a pastel portrait, so you can see the kind of activity and the process entailing in this work. Now what I've got here is an image which I've started, and you can see just what I've done. I'm concerned to sketch out first of all in the portrait the basic dimensions of the face, of the third rule between the hairline and the eyebrows, and the eyebrows and maybe the bottom of the nose, the bottom of the nose and bottom of the chin, roughly third, the line of the ears across the top of the nose, and some verticals between the eye and the corner of the mouth. Get some basics right in the image, which you can then begin to work up. I think the next stage in the game, the next stage in the process is to establish the pattern of light and darks. So what I've done so far here, as you can see, is to establish the basic dimensions and shape of the face, the relationships of the features of the face, and the basic tones of light and dark that constitute the face. And then I would begin to, as I can sit here with pastel pencils or pastel sticks, to begin to rather expressively introduce some colour into the face to make the colour live. Good. What I've also indicated here or drawn up here, which you might think is a little rather a Heath Robinson approach, is to use a very simple shaving mirror, tied up, as you can see, with cotton twine against an image against which one can use oneself, which is a fairly reliable basis for a portrait. Always there, always attentive, always follows orders, and I think therefore a self-portrait is not a bad place to start. And I've got here some pastel pencils, and I've got access to my kind of some basic colours, and I'll begin to using the range of mark making which one can do with a pastel, which might be pressing the colour into the surface, which might be expressive lines, which might be delicate lines, which might be some fairly free lines, to try and bring the the image into some kind of life. So looking at the image in my shaving mirror and the image in front of me, I can see some reds which need to be brought in, and fairly expressively doing it, some blues, some greens, some blues round by the mouth area, and some yellows and some light browns up in the upper features of the hair. At the same time as one's doing this, I think one is drawing at the same time as painting. There's always a mixture of painting and drawing at the same time with pastels, correcting the image as one goes, bring some colour in, to give some life, not to be too fussed about it, to be fairly free, and to see what kind of life, what kind of life one can begin to introduce into the face. Not to fuss it too much, not to correct it too much, but to follow the image fairly loosely, to begin to see where the colours begin to ride and in the face. And to see what kind of life and colours and suggestions it begins to make to you. So I'm working as relatively quickly as I can to begin to make some sort of gestural kind of shapes here. Again, correcting in a fairly loose way the drawing, at the same time as I'm beginning to put some colours into it. Maybe I'll revert to the pastel pencils. The pastel pencils again being really quite schematic, quite free, not to be too fussed about it, unless your style, unless your preference is extreme precision, which mine isn't, I have to say. Mine is to be fairly free, fairly open, fairly free, to see what begins to evolve. Follow the picture, let it evolve. See what begins to happen in what begins to suggest itself. Working really quite quickly, always remembering where the light is in the picture. In this case, there's a fair amount of good light coming down the bottom here. The rest is in a fair amount of shadow, and there's a little bit of light coming into the top of the eyebrow. So one can begin to pick this up here. And the hairline is probably a little too high, so I can bring the hairline down in the image. Just to remind myself and to remind the viewer that what one can do in portrait work, one can make the gestural approach to a line. One can use a lot of lines. One can press the colour into the surface. One can cross hatch surface. There's a whole range of mark making which in fact is available for the pastelist, which is really quite valuable, I think. I think you might decide as the picture evolves, you might decide that you want more precision in certain parts of it. You might want less precision. You might want rather more expressiveness. In this case, clearly there's a fair amount of looseness in how the thing is put together. And you might conclude that it needs to be a little bit more precise to pick up some kind of recognition of what it might actually represent. And I'm working fairly quickly, rather deliberately quickly, so it has a certain amount of life to itself. Forgetting, of course, the eyes are quite an important part of the picture, and the highlight in the eyes will be important too, but not to use white for the whites of the eyes, using another colour, because the whites of the eyes are going to be very misleading and very stark if one uses too much white. So one might like a light blue as opposed to white. I think I have said in the presentation that I personally don't use very much rubbing, but sometimes as you progress the picture you may want to use a piece of tissue or your hand or a rag or some of the surface to remove to make a correction. But I would minimize the correction, let the picture evolve in its own sweet way. So you can use some, certainly, but I wouldn't use too much. When I use a colour in the picture, a pretty good approach I find is to look around really quite hard as to where that colour figures somewhere else in the image. So it's not an isolated colour standing all by itself. It's actually a colour which is represented somewhere else in the image. So one is evolving the picture. One is evolving the picture really quite loosely, as you can see, really quite loosely, from the basic, the very, very fundamental basic dimensions of the face, the patterns of light and dark, and then one is looking very hard all the time. I think one very hard to find the colours of the face, to find the hidden colours, the colours which are there, but one needs to look very hard to find them. Another very obvious thing is to have your colours. Because I'm right-handed. I working at home would have my colours at my fingertip here on the right-hand side. Here I'm reaching across to the left-hand side, but have your colours easily accessible as you work on the picture. I would hope to get an image in a couple of hours, certainly within a couple of hours, and not overwork it, not over stress the thing too much. Interesting, I think, as the life begins to take some kind of a shape, as the colours are applied, because obviously there's many colours in the face which we don't often tend to acknowledge. Once again, you'll note trying to find a colour somewhere else in the picture, not losing it in one place all the time. I'm being quite honest, because in this face, which is my own, I note that there are all kinds of lines in the face and lines in the forehead, which really need to be picked out and to be given some kind of presence if you're going to be taught honest as to what kind of a face it is. One other little thing which is terribly important, which I've probably said before, but I'll say it again, is the critical importance of looking. I think just about the one thing which I was taught at school by Jerry Hicks is the importance of looking. Looking very hard at colour and line and tone and relationship. and not be scared to put that colour down. So it's just beginning, I think, to have some kind of a presence. Not very much yet, I have to say, but just beginning to. I want to show you here something of the development of a picture. We looked earlier on of me starting off the portrait using the shaving mirror. I've taken the picture home and I've worked on the picture for 2 or 3 hours and worked up something of the image of the face using some colour. And you can see here how I've looked very hard to look at the yellows, the flesh yellows, the flesh greens, the flesh blues, to begin to try and make something of the three-dimensional image. I hope you feel very much encouraged now to go and buy a set of pastels, or pick up the pastels you might already have, and to go on something of the journey as you have been illustrated with me over the last couple of years. It's fun, it's very expressive. There's lots and lots of things you can do with it in terms of dry and wet and hard and soft and so on and so forth. So the opportunity for the adventure is yours, and I'm hoping that I've shown you some lessons and some insights and some of the excitements of the journey.